In June of 1287 BCE, the sun rose over Syria and a mess. Across a floodplain and hilly region near the town of Kadesh, the remnants of battle strew fields and riverbanks. Overturned chariots, dead horses, broken weapons littered the ground. Of course, there were also human bodies. Warriors from Egypt, Nubia, Libya, the Mediterranean, Syria, and Anatolia had fallen in service to the great kings Muwattalli and Ramesses. Now they lay pierced by arrows and javelins, cut down by axes and swords, crushed by maces, or pinioned by spears. Above, dust clouds lingered over a battlefield, kicked up by wheels and hooves. On the ground, the yellow sands and dark soils mingled with blood and offal spilled from limbs and torsos. The smell must have been awful. The stink of feces from animals and terrified humans, the sour odor of vomit and sweat, and above it all, the coppery tang of blood spilled from countless wounds. We do not know how many soldiers or animals died at Kadesh. The king Ramesses makes vague allusions to overthrowing multitudes and slaughtering them all, but firm numbers of casualties are absent. Bearing in mind the Hittite attack had primarily been chariot-driven, a sudden ambush, a northward drive, and a running battle around the camp, actual human deaths may have been relatively low, perhaps a few thousand in the upper estimate, or as low as several hundred in a more conservative reading. This is not to downplay the brutality or the injuries that must have been sustained, and I'll talk about those a bit later. But overall, the number of battlefield deaths may have been surprisingly low given the supposed scale of the conflict. Realistically, far more warriors would die after the battle, brought down by wounds, infections, or simply diseases picked up on the march through unfamiliar lands. If we include those, the number of casualties for the entire campaign may have been as many as several thousand on each side. But alas, that is purely a guesstimate. There is simply no way to know. Regardless of the exact numbers, the floodplains and hills around Kadesh must have been chaotic, and amid that carnage, the survivors on both sides probably went hunting. Some soldiers would go around executing those who were too badly wounded to recover or to take captive, and in many cases, soldiers would go around desecrating enemy bodies. According to his art, Ramesses ended his time at Kadesh with a ceremony. Wall carvings at Abu Simbel and Abydos show the pharaoh seated upon his chariot. He is not riding it into battle, merely perching on the rim and watching his army as they clean up the battlefield. This process was grisly. In the art, we see officers and courtiers coming before the king, and they empty baskets upon the ground. The pile they make is composed of hands. From around 1500 BCE, at the end of the Second Intermediate Period, Egyptian rulers started to reckon their enemy dead by removing a single hand from the body. Those hands would be tallied up as evidence for the victory. We see it in art, starting with kings like Ahmose, and at least one example survives archaeologically, a pit at Avaris, filled with the right hands of unknown foes. Ramesses was pretty happy to show this process himself. At Abydos, for example, on the north wall, several horizontal registers show officials depositing these hands in a pile, while scribes stand behind with pen and paper to tally the results. On the western wall of that temple, you can even find the Sherden warriors, the king's sea people's bodyguards, actively cutting into enemy wrists with their swords and daggers. So the pharaoh happily showed the process of removing the hands and counting them, and we see the officials celebrating as the pile grows higher and higher. Oof. Presumably, this process also involved some looting of the bodies. We don't see that in the art, but you can imagine soldiers of both sides, searching the enemy dead for trinkets and valuables. Of particular interest were the officers, better armed and dressed than their countrymen, and ripe for the looting. Ramesses mentions Hittite commanders, courtiers, and royal family members among the enemy dead. Assuming that list is even partially accurate, there must have been some tempting targets amid the overturned chariots and heaps of bodies. Finding survivors to take captive, or bodies to loot, may have been quite profitable. Speaking of captives, Ramesses shows that as well. Behind the piles of hands, we have long trains of prisoners marching towards the pharaoh. They are bound with ropes tied behind their backs, or raising their arms over their shoulders. Along the line, Egyptian warriors, armed with bows and spears, shove the captives forward before the king. Hieroglyphs describe the scene as, quote, receiving the captives that his person, Ramesses, brought back by the victories of his strong arm in this wretched land of Hatti and this vile land of Naharina, together with the chiefs of every foreign land who came with the wretched one of Hatti, all together as prisoners. End quote. It's typical stuff. You can find that rhetoric on many temples and royal proclamations. In the circumstances, we can probably imagine that a similar ceremony took place in the Hittite camp. As the two armies fought to standstill, the enemy probably took Egyptians captive as well, and surely their officers and courtiers paraded them before Muwattalli. At any rate, these presentations mark the artistic end to the campaign. Finally, it was time to leave Kadesh. Presumably, this happened after the second day of combat, maybe the following dawn, maybe slightly later. Either way, the Egyptian forces packed up their equipment and withdrew from Syria. As they did so, we may wonder, who won? 3,300 years later, the outcome of Kadesh is surprisingly ambiguous. On the strategic level, it's relatively simple. Ramesses' campaign failed to achieve its goal. He did not reconquer Kadesh, and the city remained a vassal of Hatti. So, if you are purely looking at the strategic concern in the short term, then yes, it is an Egyptian defeat. However, that is the short term. As we'll see in future episodes, the failure of this campaign did not represent a decisive defeat for Ramesses or significantly damage his war-making capacity. In fact, within just 2 years, Ramesses will be back in Canaan and then head further north into Syria, leading aggressive marches deep into Hittite territory. That is the big picture layer. What about on the day itself? Tactically, the outcome of Kadesh is a little bit murkier than the strategic level. The problem here is that all of our information comes from Ramesses, and he has a vested interest in presenting himself as the victor. Cutting through the rhetoric, going behind the scenes and between the lines, so to speak, we can maybe extract a few facts. Clearly, the Egyptians had come close to a catastrophic defeat, but to the credit of the army, and maybe to the king, they had defended their camp against a surprise assault. Then, they had launched a successful counterattack, pushing the Hittites back. And on the flip side, Muwattalli had clearly failed to achieve his tactical goals. He had not destroyed the Egyptian force or killed its leader. As far as we can tell, based on Ramesses' limited description, all the Hittites had really achieved was to scatter one Egyptian division and cause some chaos in the Egyptian camp. But even that initial success had ultimately run out of steam, and by the end of that first day, the Hittites withdrew from the field, possibly with a rather bloody nose. On the second day, the two forces had lined up, and despite potentially having the advantage in numbers, the Hittites had skirmished with the Egyptians before ultimately both sides withdrew. If that counts as a Hittite victory, it seems to be extraordinarily costly and rather indecisive. So, while he may have won strategically by defending his hold on Kadesh, can we really say that Muwattalli actually won the battle itself? I'm not so sure. Obviously, we have to take my opinion with a grain of salt. I trained as an Egyptologist, not a Hittitologist, and my personal affinity for the culture of the Nile Valley undoubtedly means that I give them the benefit of the doubt. But I want to assure you, I've tried to approach the Battle of Kadesh as dispassionately and objectively as possible. When it comes to Ramesses himself, my personal attitude is rather ambivalent. In fact, if you'd asked me a few years ago, I might have said unequivocally that Ramesses lost Kadesh on both the tactical and the strategic level. However, having subsequently spent many months researching and writing this tale, having gone through the hieroglyph texts, the translations, and the volumes of scholarship around this battle, I did come out of it a lot more uncertain than expected. Whatever his personal failings, his grandiosity, his self-aggrandizement, and the very obvious mistakes he made on his approach to Kadesh, the limited information we have about the tactical engagement does make me think that the Egyptians came away from that in a slightly better position than their Hittite rivals. Clearly, it was the most limited, skin-of-your-teeth victories you could possibly define, and that limited victory did not change the larger strategic failures that I've already discussed. But having spent this much time with the material, I do think that the successful defense of the Egyptian camp, the excellent timing of his reinforcement troops, which suggests forward planning, and the successful counterattack actually deserve more credit for Ramesses and the Egyptian army than is popularly recognized in the discourse. So, with all of that in mind, if you asked me who won the actual Battle of Kadesh, the on-the-ground engagement in front of the city, I might just give the victory to Ramesses. Call it 51% to 49, the most limited margin possible. But I think there is just enough information there to say that he did come away slightly better than Muwattalli. Unfortunately, the picture is complicated by what comes after. In the years that follow, the Hittite-Egyptian War will resume with additional campaigns. In some cases, Ramesses and his army will invade Syria again, and push even further north than Kadesh itself. Then there was the ideological war, the one in which Ramesses and the Hittites sought to control the narrative for their respective audiences. We will explore those tales as we reach them chronologically. But long story short, the aftermath of Kadesh is less clear-cut than we might like, and that significantly affects our understanding 3,000 years later. There's a little bit more to say about the aftermath on the battlefield itself, specifically a hypothesis that Ramesses may have punished his cowardly troops with an early form of decimation. I'll discuss that idea in the epilogue. For now, let's keep the story moving. The Egyptians withdrew and started their southward march. It is possible that the Hittite army shadowed them as they headed south. A set of letters, written some 15 years later, might hint at post-combat maneuvers. If those records are accurate, Muwattalli may have led his army south just behind Ramesses until the Egyptians were gone. After that, the king of Hatti might have turned eastward to other nearby targets. Unfortunately, those records are fragmentary, and it's quite unclear if they actually describe Kadesh or a set of earlier conflicts. Again, I'll explore those records in the future, when they actually appear chronologically. For now, the best we can say is that maybe the Hittites followed Ramesses. But then again, maybe they didn't. Of course, the pharaoh mentions none of that. In one of the Kadesh texts, often called the poem or literary record, The king describes his return to Egypt. It is brief and, as you'd expect, rather grandiose. Quote, "Thus his person, the king, turned peacefully southward. He set off back to Egypt in satisfaction, with his troops and chariots, all life, stability, and dominion being with him, the gods and goddesses being amulets of protection for his body, and subduing all foreign lands through fear of him. It was the might of his person that protected his army. All foreign lands praised his beautiful visage." Arriving peacefully in the Black Land, Kemet, at the city P. Ramesses, great of victories, and resting in his palace of life and dominion, just like Ra, who is within his horizon. The gods of the land came to him in greeting, and they said, "Welcome, our beloved son, king of south and north," etc., etc. The gods have granted Ramesses 1,000,000 said festivals, and eternity upon the throne of Ra. All lands and all foreign lands are overthrown and slain beneath his sandals, eternally and forever. End quote. The narrative ends there in a happily ever after, and with that, the story of Kadesh concludes. For now. Again, there will be epilogues or codas to the tale of this campaign. About 4 years after the battle, Ramesses would commission his grandiose art and hieroglyphs. And 10 years after that, we will see the pharaoh debating this story with the king of Hatti himself. But that is a tale for another day. For the rest of this episode, I would like to explore an important part of the soldiers' experience in war, specifically their injuries and their treatment. We have a remarkably detailed record of the medical procedures around wounds and traumas. I will describe those after the break. If this is your stepping off point, thank you for listening. Otherwise, I'll see you in a moment. The Battle of Kadesh came to its end. In the aftermath, the Egyptian camp must have bustled with activity, soldiers looting the dead or bringing captives to present to the king, porters delivering supplies, tending to the animals. There were also the medical areas, a series of tents or open space somewhere in the camp where injured troops could receive treatment from physicians. Egyptian doctors, or swnw, are remarkably well recorded. Papyrus documents, artifacts, and artistic scenes describe aspects of their profession and medical knowledge. When it came to injuries, the sort you might sustain in battle, we do have a top-tier historical source. It is called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, after the antiquities dealer who bought it in the 1860s. Originally composed around 1600 BCE during the Second Intermediate Period, the papyrus includes diagnoses for external injuries and wounds. They range from minor to severe and include a variety of treatments. There are 48 cases in total on the surviving papyrus. I'm not going to read all of them, but a few examples from different parts of the body and different levels of severity will give us an idea of the process. It's a remarkably detailed document. So how would a swnw, physician, treat the battle injuries at Kadesh? First, we have case number 10. Someone has a cut or a laceration on their eyebrow. A sharp weapon has cut the brow to the bone. Following the papyrus, the physician may approach it as follows. Quote, "If you examine a man having a wound in the top of his eyebrow that penetrates to the bone, say to him, 'I can handle this.' Hold fast the slash wound with thread, and then bind it with fresh meat for the first day. If you find the wound shifting with respect to its stitches, then hold it fast with 2 bandages which are joined one to the other. Apply oil and honey every day until he is well." End quote. In battle, wounds like this were probably common. Axe blades, swords, even a slingshot might slash the eyebrow, leaving an open wound. For the physician, this case was relatively minor. A painful inconvenience to be sure, and left untreated, the injury might fester and become infected. More on that in a moment. But the cut to the eye was readily treatable, and the papyrus has the method. First, the physician inspects the injury, then he stitches it. To protect the edges of the wound, the prescription is fresh meat applied on the first day. That might sound slightly strange today, but apparently it does have merit. Experiments in the 19th and 20th century found that fresh muscle tissue can assist with wound healing. The meat must be fresh, with a slightly acidic content, around pH 5.5. Left too long, the pH level rises, and that begins to hinder the treatment. As a result, the methods on this papyrus universally advise fresh meat for injuries and wounds. After that, the physician recommends a daily application of oil and honey. Again, both of these might genuinely be helpful. The oil, for example, was the Egyptian merkhet, a type of vegetable oil. Depending on the vegetable in question, such as palm oil, it might offer antioxidant properties. Similarly, honey, which in its natural form has antibacterial and antifungal benefits. Applying these to the wound daily could protect from infection, help keep the injury clean, and assist the recovery. It's not terribly far off a treatment you might use today. The eyebrow wound was painful, but treatable without too much trouble. What about something more severe? In case number 4, things get a bit more alarming. Someone has received a powerful blow to their head, perhaps from a sword or a battle axe. The cut has penetrated the scalp and cracked the casing of the skull itself. Ouch. The wound is serious and probably quite messy. The skin layers atop our skulls have many blood vessels running through them. Even a minor cut will bleed profusely. Presumably, an attendant would clean the injury first, before the physician examined it. At that point, we have the diagnosis and treatment. Quote, "If you should examine a man with a cut on his head that has penetrated to the bone and is splitting the skull, you must palpate the wound, that is, touch it lightly with your fingers to get a feeling. If you find something shifting under your fingers, and the swelling protrudes while the patient bleeds from nostrils and ears, and also suffers rigidity in his neck, then you will say to him, 'This is a medical condition that I will fight with.' Do not bandage the patient. Place him seated upon the ground at his mooring stake until the critical time has passed. His treatment is to sit upright. Make for him 2 supports of brick upon which the patient will lean. Do that until you know that he has reached the turning point. Then put ointment upon his head and massage or soften the back of his neck, together with both of his shoulders. Do the same for any man whose skull is split like this." End quote. The injury is severe, not easily managed. The papyrus tells us that with its level 2 response. Unlike the earlier case, the physician does not say, "I will deal with this." Here, he says, "I will fight with it." A successful outcome is not guaranteed. The physician must wait until the critical phase has passed. The treatment itself is a combination of topical ointments and physical therapy. The patient must sit, literally, at his mooring post, like resting upright against a pole. Presumably, they stay there for a while until the physician is confident they're not going to die. Hopefully, they will soon leave that danger zone and be ready for treatment. Now, something difficult indeed. The soldier, or whoever, has received a severe head injury that has crushed part of the skull. Quote, "If you examine a man for a cutting wound on his head that penetrates to the bone and is smashing in part of his skull, you must palpate the wound, examine it by touch. If you find that this crushed fracture is deep and sunken beneath your fingers, and if the patient is bleeding from nostrils, ears, and suffering rigidity in his back, if he is unable to turn his head and look at both of his shoulders or his chest, then you will say to him, "This is a condition that cannot be dealt with." You should not bandage the wound. Place him seated upon the ground at his mooring place until the critical time passes. End quote. The wound is open, cutting right through the scalp and fracturing, even crushing part of the skull. Such an injury could easily come from a mace, the blunt end of an axe, or even a stone hurled by a sling or from a parapet above. Unfortunately, the power of the blow has shattered part of the skull and potentially damaged the brain matter within. In this case, the physician has reached the limit of his capabilities. The blow was too severe, the wound too penetrating. At best, he can observe the patient for a day or two to see if they were able to recover by themselves. But from the wording, the outcome seems rather in doubt. Perhaps palliative care was the only option remaining. Such a response brings us face to face with the limits of ancient Egyptian knowledge. We may think that because they practiced mummification, preserving the body to a sometimes astonishing degree, that the ancient medical workers had sophisticated knowledge of the insides. Sadly, that was not the case. Although they did remove the internal organs, the embalmers did that through a very small hole in the side of the body. Basically, they reached in with their arm and felt around blindly. The Egyptians' cultural veneration of the body and their desire to preserve it as intact as possible would have limited their chances to dissect or even autopsy the deceased. As a result, the functioning of the organs and how to treat them still remained largely mysterious. We can explore that in greater detail in future, but if you're interested, I did an interview with Dr. Bob Breyer a couple of years ago where we discussed some of those questions. I'll put a link to that interview in the show notes. Those are some of the head injuries. What about the rest of the body? As the soldiers engaged with their enemy, arrows and slingshots flew through the air, dealing pain and death to many. Naturally, many of those missiles would strike different parts of the body, and in the melee itself, weapons and shields were swinging about violently, causing all kinds of damage. Fortunately, the Edwin Smith Papyrus also records treatments for these. I'll run through a couple briefly, just to give you an idea. In case number 36, a patient has suffered a fracture in their upper arm or humerus, probably quite common in battle, and archaeologists also find them in the graves of workers, like the tombs of the pyramid builders at Giza. In this case, the physician performs some recognizable tasks. They lay the patient down with some padding or support under their shoulders. That raises the broken arm, allowing gravity to assist. The doctor takes the loose or separated part of the limb and carefully realigns it. Then they apply a splint with layers of bandages on each side of the arm to keep it as straight as possible for healing. This case is for a clean fracture, no jagged edges. There are other cases for more complicated examples with differing levels of severity. In case number 44, the patient has fractured ribs. Again, probably quite common in battle and monument building. This one is intriguing because it's another case of level 3 severity, in the sense of, I cannot treat this. But it's not life-threatening, just beyond the technological limits of the time. The papyrus describes the fracture and the contusions or swelling that develop on the surface. Alas, the doctor has no physical tool to repair the ribs. They must let it heal of its own accord, and they specifically say, do not bind or restrict the injury. The patient just has to wait it out. Finally, we get a really interesting case because it deals with infection. The ancients did not understand or know about bacteria, but they could observe the symptoms and, through trial and error, determine some solutions. I'll read this one fully because it's quite intriguing. Quote, If you examine a man with an infected wound in his chest, and heat flows out of that wound into your hand, that is, it's inflamed, and the man himself is feverish on account of it, and his flesh will not accept a bandage, and the wound will not accept new skin, and oily secretions, or pus, drip from the injury, say to the patient, "This is a condition I can deal with." Treatment. Prepare for him the cooling remedies, including leaves of the willow tree and ziziphus, and the mineral kesneti. Apply that to the wound. Also prepare leaves of the ima tree, together with ox dung, ground up rushes, and the mineral kesneti. Apply. Thirdly, prepare a remedy for drying the wound, being made of green powder or malachite, the weshbet material, possibly pumice, and crushed frit. Grind it up and apply it to the wound with bandages. Apply natron salt and the fat of the ibex. Finally, make a powder of red poppy extract, together with neshesh seeds, carob beans, and crushed sycamore leaves. Apply that to the wound with bandages. End quote. The treatment is detailed with several layers, a poultice to cool the skin, another to dry the wound, and, last, a treatment perhaps to soothe the pain itself. A reference to the red poppy, or shepenen, might indicate a kind of topical relief, or opiate. So the physician had a variety of tools to apply on an infected wound. It's a wonderfully detailed response, considering the limits of their bacterial knowledge. Apparently, through trial and error, they had figured out mixtures and solutions that worked. This is just a small sample from the Edwin Smith Papyrus. But you get the idea. Every situation proceeds in the same language and formula. Describe the injury, what the physician should say to the patient, and then the treatment itself. In that sense, the Edwin Smith Papyrus reads like a doctor's manual, something to consult actively during the practice of medicine. You can imagine the physicians, or swnw, sitting next to their patients with a copy of the scroll somewhere nearby, maybe in their bags if they were experienced, or if not, or if the case was unusual, unrolling the papyrus to check the formula. Hopefully, they did that consultation in private, to avoid upsetting the injured. Today, the Edwin Smith Papyrus is preserved in the New York Academy of Medicine. Fortunately, there are translations available in the public domain, notably the one by James Henry Breasted from 1903. I'll put a link to that in the episode description. More recently, there was a revised translation by an Egyptologist working together with a modern medical professional, and they re-examined the text in the light of 21st century knowledge. I'll put a reference to that in the show notes for those who might be interested. The ancient Egyptian treatment of external injury is remarkably well documented, and many of its methods might be recognizable today. Centuries of trial and error picked up on battlefields and monumental work projects gave the swnw a sophisticated knowledge of the limbs, head, and bodily traumas. This must have come in handy at Kadesh, when hundreds of warriors needed care in the aftermath of battle. Whether it was light, a minor cut or break, moderate, a stab wound or fracture, or the severe, the untreatable cases, there was an approach for every situation. As the dust settled over the battlefield, many soldiers could receive prompt and effective treatment. Hopefully, with such skilled physicians available, many of them would make it home. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by you, the listeners. I would like to thank Erin, who recently joined as a priest-level subscriber over on my Patreon. Erin, thank you kindly. Your generosity is most appreciated. I hope that Bast, or Bastet, the fearsome lioness and domestic cat, will bless you and your beloved pet Barbara, and grant you both a long and happy life. Of course, I must also thank the rest of the clergy, the fine folks at the top of the Patreon tiers, who give most generously every month. My thanks to Kate, Eryan, Suyon, Setnacht, James, Chris, Dan, Siyen, Karen, Jean, Jeffrey, James B., Veronica, Daniel, Ashley, Nidin, Andy and Chelsea, Mycost, Yola, TJ, Terry, Eric, and Linda. Folks, you are all too generous. I am in your debt. It is thanks to you that my wife and I were recently able to go to London in order to attend a concert by the group Blackpink. I'm rather a fan of them, but they've never visited New Zealand, so it was lovely to actually see them live. Thank you very much for making that possible. To everyone who listens to the show, who leaves comments on apps or YouTube, reviews on Apple, or simply a thumbs up on the various social media channels, thank you very much for your support. I hope you're enjoying the show. I will see you soon. Howdy folks, welcome to the epilogue. If you happen to be reading Wikipedia or some popular histories about the Battle of Kadesh, you may have come across a hypothesis that suggests that on the second day of battle, Ramesses actually punished his troops violently with a sort of decimation. The idea goes that on the second day of battle, Ramesses lined up his troops and punished them for their cowardice. You can find this interpretation in 3 works. Firstly, a book by Professor Toby Wilkinson titled Ramesses the Great, Egypt's King of Kings, from 2023. In that book, Wilkinson writes, quote, Ramesses harangued the troops who had deserted him, accusing them of weakness, cowardice, and disloyalty. At dawn the next day, in a brutal display of ruthless military discipline, Ramesses made an example of the worst offenders, the cowardly troops of the Amun division. Branding them rebels, he, quote, My Majesty overpowered them, I slew them without sparing. They sprawled before my horses, and lay slain in bloodied heaps. End quote. This description was based on a paper by Dr. Hans Gödecke titled The Battle of Kadesh, a Reassessment from 1985. It also appears in a book by Mark Healy from Osprey Publishing titled Kadesh, 1300 BC, Clash of the Warrior Kings, or the alternate title, The Warrior Pharaoh, Ramesses II, and the Battle of Kadesh. The books by Wilkinson and Healy build off Gödecke, and in those we get a picture of Ramesses decimating his troops, Roman style, in punishment for their cowardice. Obviously, I did not follow that viewpoint myself in my presentation of the battle, nor do the scholars that I follow in my analysis of the story. Historians like Peter Brand, Claude Obsemer, Anthony Spellinger, Kenneth Kitchen, Alan Gardner, and James Henry Breasted, all of whom published detailed works on the Battle of Kadesh. Gödecke's interpretation is the fringe reading, but it's an interesting take. To cover all of the bases, let's discuss this idea briefly. Firstly, there is no evidence for such decimation practices in the New Kingdom Egyptian army. Certainly there was punishment for troops, like beatings or even disfigurement. In episode 213, I quoted some texts about the soldier's life, which allegedly included regular discipline and physical punishment. But to date, there is no record of a ruler mass executing their troops, personally or otherwise, as a response to cowardice. On current evidence, that just doesn't seem their style when it comes to motivation. Ramesses' description of the slaughter on day 2 is slightly vague in its wording, and within those passages, he does use the word swnw, or rebels, to describe his targets. For Gödecke, that implied that the victims of the king's aggression were Ramesses' own troops. Unfortunately, that is a misinterpretation of the term swnw. In Egyptian royal narrative, all enemies, no matter how legitimate or powerful, are equally described as rebels, swnw. That applies to great empires like Hatti or minor uprisings in Libya and Nubia. It's a trope of pharaonic messaging that treats the king's authority as absolute and resistance as rebellion. So when Ramesses describes his enemy as swnw, it does not automatically mean that they were literally disobedient, like troops rebelling against him, merely that they were generic foes. Additionally, the idea that Ramesses executed the division of Amun specifically is unsupported in the text. The king does not even mention Amun, Ra, Ptah, or any troops in this particular section, nor does he mention the soldiers, officers, or chariots, whom he has described repeatedly in his tale. So the interpretation that Ramesses is killing his own soldiers seems inconsistent with the way he has described things in the text. Ramesses' description of the slaughter is vague, but there's no solid reason to think that he's attacking anyone but the Hittites. Thirdly, this interpretation seems incompatible with the way Ramesses chooses to describe his role in the conflict. Throughout the tale, you may have noticed that Ramesses likes to emphasize his personal valor. Yes, in the story, his troops are described as cowardly. But Ramesses repeatedly emphasizes the idea that he was braver than them and that he protected his troops in their failure. We actually see this in the very next passage just after the slaughter. Having overthrown the rebels, swnw, the king now calls himself, quote, the ruler who protects his army, valiant through his strong arm, the rampart for his troops on the day of battle. End quote. The king consistently paints himself as the savior of his soldiers. They had failed in their courage, but he made up for it. Now, we might view that as mere rhetoric, hiding the true reality. But since all of these interpretations are based on the text, we have to treat the text on its own terms. Ramesses consistently presents himself as the savior of his troops. It wouldn't make much sense to do that while also claiming, I killed my own troops. Finally, and most importantly, the description of this slaughter comes immediately after Ramesses is talking about, quote, overthrowing myriads by my strong arm. That is, after he is done slaughtering the Hittites. It also comes immediately before those Hittites ask for peace. Ramesses describes his slaughter among the swnw rebels. Following that slaughter, Muwattalli sends his message of ceasefire. The king of Hatti is clearly responding directly to Ramesses' ferocity, and he begs the king, quote, do not overwhelm us, the Hittites. Behold, your power is great. Your might lies heavy upon the land of Hatti. Behold, you spent yesterday slaughtering myriads, and you came today and left no heirs. Do not be so harsh, O victorious king. Peace is better than war. Give us breath. End quote. So, in the same passage as the slaughter, we get the response from the Hittites begging Ramesses to stop. When you take that context into account, it seems fairly clear the king was attacking the Hittites, not his own soldiers. Thank you for listening to this epilogue. I don't usually spend so much time deconstructing one particular hypothesis. I've done it in this case because the argument appears on Wikipedia, and it also appears in popular histories, which are more likely to find their way out into the general public. When that happens, and when the scholar does not properly explain the particular interpretation, it can lead to broad and serious misunderstandings of ancient practices. There is plenty to discuss about the Battle of Kadesh in terms of violence, but suggesting that Ramesses turned on his own troops and slaughtered them mercilessly seems to go quite far beyond the evidence of the text itself. For those reasons, and more, I did not follow this interpretation in my history, and nor have most of the scholars that I've read discussing the Battle of Kadesh. Hopefully, you at least found this interesting and a glimpse into the logic as to how we reconstruct these histories. For now, thank you for listening. I'll see you soon.